Hello there, Evie here. Welcome to what I'm calling the most comprehensive BitFenix Aegis review on YouTube. Now, I'm not making that claim lightly, and I'm not just talking video length. Anyone can make a really long video about anything. I've tried to keep the content as dense as I normally do in terms of information per minute, or whatever you will call the metric there. But basically, this video started out like any other video I do about any other case. There are just so many options available with this case, I didn't want to leave any stone unturned and have anybody questioning anything about this case. So hopefully, once you've seen this video, you'll have all the answers you need as to whether you want to buy the case or not. This isn't a sponsor or anything, I just wanted to make as good a video as I can. So if you appreciate the video and you like it, please let me know through subscribing, comments, and liking the video, or disliking the video, and I will catch you in a second for the start of the video and some commentary. And also, if you stick around to the end, keep an eye out for the background of my desktop, that might change, let me know what you think. See you in a second, and thanks for watching. The BitFenix Aegis is a Micro ATX case that's standing on the larger side, a 470mm tall, 205mm wide and 480mm deep. It's standing taller than many ATX cases. It comes enclosed, in my situation at least, a slightly damaged cardboard box, wrapped in a foam bag and bookended by two expanded polystyrene molds. Speaking of which, these seem to have not dealt with the transportation very well. I don't think this is down to poor packaging, but rather poor delivery. This package has clearly had some impact that pierced both sides of the box and caused full-length partial splits to both polystyrene molds. Anyway, lifting the foam bag from the case reveals a large amount of plastic film to protect the plastic panels to the top and front. And getting rid of all this film reveals the case in all of its glossy glory. Now, don't take that as a negative. If you can stay on top of the fingerprint marks and dust, these can be really cool looking cases. We'll take more of a stance on the looks of the case later on, but let's get into the details. The front or top I/O consists of a 3-stage fan speed button, a power switch, a reset switch, two USB 3.0 ports, separate headphone and microphone jacks, and of course power and drive activity LEDs. Just above the front I/O is a push-actuated removable filter panel, which I think is excellent, and underneath the panel is enough room to fit two 120mm or two 140mm fans, which is a setup designed for a push-pull water cooling configuration. To get a full breakdown of all the different configurations of radiators and fans with specific measurements, please go to the BitFenix webpage linked in the video description. But definitely keep in mind that you could store the fans above the chassis underneath the filter and have a radiator inside the chassis if you have any really big plans inside the case. There are so many options available here. The filter panel itself is a pretty robust perforated steel encased plastic panel which has a foam layer compressed between the plastic structure and the steel cover. I think this area of the case deserves special recognition for its broad capability and interesting design. Moving on to the front, since this is the Aegis and not the Aegis core, the front panel contains an LCD panel behind a glossy plastic panel, which we'll check out more a little later. To the bottom of the glossy panel, you'll find some gill-like ventilation grills, but to add to the ventilation, there are also perforated and filtered strips to each side of the panel. We'll see how this affects the thermal testing results later on. And of course there is a windowed side panel which, since it's made of plastic, will be prone to scratches and dust. But like any other plastic side panel, this is fine if you can stay on top of it. However, micro scratches will be inevitable, and that's just the nature of a plastic side panel window. So if you want a crystal clear look into your case for a long period of time, you'll need to invest in a case with a glass side panel window. The rear of the case is pretty standard, with two top grommets for water-cooled tubing. Below these is an included 120mm fan, which has a higher and lower mounting position. It's interesting that they went for holes over slots. To the left of the fan position is the rear I/O position, and below are the removable PCI Express slot covers, and to the right is a ventilation section to encourage airflow around the graphics card area. Finally, at the bottom is the power supply unit position, which you'll notice has multiple holes to support pretty much any ATX power supply unit. The bottom of the case has a full-length filter, which fits relatively loosely between the 4 feet. This loose fit helps with replacing it, but you'll need to tilt the case forward in order to remove the filter without needing to completely lay the case on its side. The filter itself is held in place with 4 magnets, one in each corner. I think there is more to be desired from the bottom filter, especially since the top filter was so impressive. If there were at least a couple more center magnets, this would have made it feel much more stable. The feet that guide the filter into its position are predominantly plastic, but they have a firm foam layer that allows the case to be slid across the desk with no wear to the foam or damage to the table. But if you wanted to remove the feet, you can remove the center screw. Removing the side panel takes the typical removal of 2 screws to the rear. Each screw has an included washer, but the washers are flimsy, and a better implementation of this would have been nice considering the glossy finish. Removing the panel was a really smooth action, and this is probably down to the smooth glossy finish of the entire panel, including the hooks and slots. The other side panel, on the other hand, wasn't quite the same. The removal of the screws was identical, but sliding the panel out was a very difficult task. I can only presume it's a hit and miss as to whether you'll get an easy or difficult panel to work with. The removal of the top panel is a little different to all the other panels. 2 screws need removing from the rear of the panel, but after that it's a different story. Since all of the front I/O is contained in the top panel on a PCB, all the cables need untangling from the case before the panel can be removed. It's unfortunate that the PCB is green, but it's not in a noticeable location, so it's not that big of a deal. And the hot glue keeping all the wires in place is pretty tidy, at least on this product, so again, it's not all that bad. Just so we're all clear on the build going forward from here, I won't be using the fan speed controller function, but it uses a 4-pin Molex connector for power and supports a total of 4 fans, but only 3-pin fans, not 4-pin fans. So with the top panel out of the way, we can work on removing the front panel. The front panel is fixed using pop-on plastic clips, so the panel can be removed by pulling on it. It does take some force, but it comes away relatively easily. There is a long cable attached to the front panel, which is what powers the LCD display behind the plastic front panel, which we'll check out a little later on. There is bound to be a few people thinking that fans can fit into this zone, but if you put fans there, they will have substantially less free area for airflow. Plus, there is plenty of space inside the case for a massive water cooling rig. Going over the back of the LCD panel. To the bottom right is a button I have no ideas about, to the top right is a hardware reset button, and to the left is a 5-pin connector that only uses 4 pins, but plugs into a USB 2.0 9-pin header on the motherboard, which powers and sends image data to the panel. And of course, the side vents have foam strips to ventilate the intake air. Now onto the front filter. You may notice the striking resemblance to the bottom filter, which is a good cost-saving measure. Now this isn't a problem by itself, but it's pretty clear that this design works far better for the bottom of the case than it does for the front of the case. The filter came attached to the case in this orientation, however it doesn't exactly fit very well onto the chassis this way. When the bottom aligns, the top is out of place and vice versa. But it works far better when the filter is mounted the other way round, but this way the cable from the front panel can't go through the filter at the top, so it seems there's something to be lost either way. So let's take a look at the internals of the chassis. So the bottom is one of the drive cages that can support 2 3.5-inch drives, and the front can support a 280 or 360mm radiator with fans. And up top is a 3.5-inch drive cage very similar to the one at the bottom. This one can also support 2 3.5-inch drives and can be removed from the underside of the 2.5-inch drive cage above it. The 2.5-inch drive cage can support 2 2.5-inch drives and has multiple layers of removal. You can remove the internal 2.5-inch drive rails individually to create an internal 5.25-inch drive bay and still have support for the 3.5-inch drive bay below. Or you can remove the entire unit to allow more room to max out the water cooling space, or just remove it for aesthetic reasons. The top of the chassis has a lot going on. It can support up to 240 or 280mm radiators with fans, and there is a good amount of room to mess around with push-pull configurations. It really sucks what's coming up in a minute, which means we're not going to be able to water cool in this case, otherwise we would be water cooling the crap out of this thing. You may have spotted this extra frame piece that's connected to the top of the chassis. This is a reservoir mount that in itself is quite versatile. It can be connected to the top of the case and also the front of the case by the 120mm mounting slots. I'm showing it positioned lower down in the case, but it can be mounted higher up as well. You could also mount it to a radiator, or even a set of fans connected to a radiator, maybe with a push-pull configuration, or just mount it to a radiator with one set of fans. It's a simple part but allows for a lot of options. But if you don't like that radiator mount, there are always other options. So the top of the case is clearly very versatile, and this isn't a bad angle to appreciate the rubber grommets, which is a great inclusion compared to bare holes in the panel. And the rear of the case has two upper holes for water cooling seen earlier, and an included rear fan which turns out can spin up to 1600 RPM. And moving further down, you can see the removable PCI Express slot covers, and the reason we're not going to be water cooling this thing later. I'm going to assume that the delivery company's poor handling of this case caused both the damaged packaging and somehow managed to unhook the power supply unit cover, which ended up scraping the motherboard tray, and then it managed to wedge one of the hooks into the rear of the chassis. So after spending a little time trying to remove it, I thought removing the lower 3.5-inch hard disk drive cage first would free up a little more space to deal with the problem, and we could also take a look at the hard disk drive cages at the same time. There are a few positions along the bottom of the chassis where the 3.5-inch drive cage can go, and you'll notice that a lot of the chassis is riddled with holes, which I'll do my best to cover as quickly as possible. The accessories box has a good spread of hardware without going overboard. We have 4 sets of 3.5-inch drive sleds and 2 sets of 2.5-inch drive sleds, which we'll look into more later on. There are also 4 fan screws, 4 power supply unit screws, 6 2.5-inch drive screws, an extra standoff with a standoff screw adapter, 13 motherboard and pump bracket screws, 8 cable ties, and a water pump bracket which has a nice foam padding and has as many holes as, insert your opposing political opinion here, for maximum compatibility. I think considering the amount of options available in this case, this is a great set of accessories, without including way more than most people would use. So how about that pump mounting bracket? Where can that go? Well, straight out of the box, it can be mounted to the top of the lower 3.5-inch drive cage, but wouldn't be able to be mounted to the top of the upper 3.5-inch drive cage. Not that you'd want to, since it would be connected to the top of the chassis. And unfortunately, the underside of the top-mounted 3.5-inch drive cage cannot support the pump bracket either. But I think that's fair, since hanging a pump with potentially a reservoir attached from a hanging 3.5-inch drive cage that's also hanging from a 5.25-inch drive bay probably wouldn't be very secure. However, the bracket can be supported directly from the bottom of the case, and since there are so many holes on the bracket, it can be supported pretty much less than every centimeter across the bottom of the case. So with the hard disk drive cages and accessories out of the way, the power supply unit cover can be untangled from the chassis. Annoyingly enough, one of the hooks ended up being a bit mangled since it was wedged into the back of the case, and there was a fair bit of scuffing to the motherboard tray as well as some slightly bent steel to the rear. The bottom of the case has a great amount of ventilation space, which depending on your lower front fan choice can support a 120 or 140mm fan. You can also see a few cable management loops further to the back, and to the rear you can find 4 rubber pads and another ventilation section for the power supply unit. And the motherboard tray has plenty to talk about. If you take a look to the right, you can see a mount for a 2.5-inch drive, and just to the left of that is a panel reinforcement bracket and one of the many grommets just above. There are 8 pre-installed standoffs ready to take a Micro ATX motherboard, and there are a few rubber grommets up top to deal with your fan and CPU power connectors. And the rear of the motherboard tray allows access to the rear of the 2.5-inch drive cage to the top left, and there are plenty of well-positioned cable management loops scattered all over the place, which is fantastic. However, there really isn't a lot of depth to the rear of the motherboard tray, which is a little disappointing, and you'll see the result of that later on. An interesting removable 2.5-inch drive mounting panel can be found at the bottom of the motherboard tray right next to the power supply unit mounting position. It can be taken out by removing 2 screws to the rear of the case and then can be slid to the side to disengage the hooks to the top and bottom. I'm not going to be using this panel in this build, but you can see here how it would handle a 2.5-inch hard disk drive. Okay, so let's actually install some hardware. Sorry for the long wait up to this point, there's just so much this case has to offer. I, for some reason, always start a build with the power supply unit, so to be on the safe side in order to prevent negative comments, I would recommend you install the power supply unit fan side down. Once the power supply unit is sat on the rubber pads, the included power supply unit screws can be used to secure the power supply unit to the back of the chassis. You shouldn't need to sort this out if you get this case, but I needed to reshape one of the hooks that was damaged in shipping. But once that's been bent back into shape, the panel can be lowered over the power supply unit and slid to the left to engage the hooks with the slots in the motherboard tray. And to secure it in position, the 2 screws can be replaced in the bottom of the chassis. Notice you can go for a ludicrously large power supply unit that is over 220mm, but if you want to keep the power supply unit within the dimensions of the power supply unit cover, you'll want a power supply unit that's 180mm or under. The one I'm using is 160mm, which is pretty standard. Now for the motherboard. If you're one of the lucky few that have been watching AV Techie videos for a while, you'll notice that we're starting with a bare motherboard. This is purely so I could continue to work with the test bench setup before transferring to this case. I should really look into getting another 6700K. Dropping the motherboard in wasn't too bad, since there's a good amount of room to the side and the top, and the pre-installed standoffs make this a very quick process. So that was a clean installation, but how about the front fans? The front fans for this build are going to be 2 140mm 2200 RPM EVGA fans. This will bring the total case fans up to 3 to fall in line with the standard thermal testing setup. There's some pretty drastic information coming later in regards to the front fan connection. If you're really looking to get this case, please stick around to avoid any fatal fan situations. Like I said earlier, you can fit a 360mm radiator to the front of this case. This is just a little resemblance to give you an idea of how that would look, but just to reiterate, the fans need to go inside the case to maintain the free airflow within the front panel. I won't go over the installation of every cable in the system, but it's useful to go over the major ones to get an idea of how the cable management system works. Routing the CPU power cable up to the top right of the case means it can go through the motherboard tray via the top corner grommet. This grommet position is extremely useful, and it's great to see it in this case. There are only a couple of cases that fail to put this one in, and I would recommend looking out for this grommet when choosing your case. The motherboard power connector is far more difficult to route in pretty much any Micro ATX tower style case. Due to its thickness and length, it'll generally need winding around the back of the motherboard tray in any case. But thanks to the fair amount of cable management loops, that's not really an issue. And the GPU power cables were able to sneak under the motherboard power cable and behind the motherboard tray to stay out of sight from the side panel window. I'm not going to bore you with the full step-by-step installation of the CPU, cooler and RAM, but we have an i7-6700K CPU being cooled by a Cooler Master Hyper 212 Evo, and for RAM we have 2 4GB sticks of Crucial Ballistix and 2 8GB sticks of G.Skill Ripjaws 5 for a total of 24GB of RAM. Well, how about installing some storage? Well, in the front of house position, we're going to install the Samsung 240GB 840. I actually really like the installation method here. You essentially push the screw holes on the side of the drive into these rubber coated spikes, and around the other side you can screw in some standard SSD screws. I'd also feel comfortable putting a hard disk drive in this position, since it's nice and secure and the rubber grommets for the screws and the coating on the spikes will dampen the vibrations very well. As for the other 2.5-inch drives, these can be prepared for the drive cage by using these clip-on sleds, which just connect by pushing the posts into the screw holes on the sides of the drives. Just so you know, we're using a 240GB Kingston SSD as an editing scratch disk, and there is a 2TB hard disk drive on the left for the mass storage of this system. This really is a 1-minute installation process that I'd like to see implemented more often. However, I do wonder if the tight-fitting posts could cause wear to the threads of the hard disk drive screw holes after a lot of installations. But that's not an immediate problem, so we can simply slide the drives into the 2.5-inch drive bay. The fit is quite firm, which is good since you really don't want, let's say, a mechanical drive rattling around. As for SATA power to the drives, this was a slightly awkward connection. Due to the length of the typical SATA power cable, I wasn't able to have the cable reach high enough to avoid bridging the panel gap in the motherboard tray, so these cables are going to be on show through the side panel window. The same goes for the on-show SSD. Unfortunately, the motherboard tray doesn't cover some large portions of the top and bottom of the case, which leads to a lot of the behind-the-scenes cables being on show. Something that might irritate those who plan to use a lot of fans on their build, the ability to hide a large fan hub behind the motherboard tray is pretty limited. The only place I could store my Silverstone 8-header fan hub was behind the power supply unit. Everywhere else behind the motherboard tray would cause a clash when replacing the side panel. So this meant that the fans on the CPU cooler needed rotating to allow the fan cables to exit through the bottom of the fans. This in turn allows the cables to go through the grommets at the bottom of the case. The hub itself has a long cable to connect to the CPU fan header at the top of the motherboard. I would really recommend getting around 4 fan cable extenders if you want to get this case, just to make sure your fans can connect wherever you want them to in a neat fashion. Replacing the front panel is a very neat process. The 5-pin header needs to be reconnected in order for the front panel LCD to work, and all that's needed is a couple of pushes top and bottom for it to clip into place. The top panel is a very different story, however. This panel houses all of the front I/O that needs connecting to the motherboard. To save on time a little, I'm going to skip over all of the connecting of the cables to the motherboard, but keep in mind the USB 2.0 connector for the front panel LCD. As for the GPU, the first step with any GPU installation is freeing up the PCI Express slot covers, which is simple enough in this case. Unfortunately, due to the lack of fan cable length, I had to route the fan cables down past the PCI Express slot, so they needed to be out of the way for the GPU to slot in worry-free. With the GPU in place without any issues, all that's required is to get some power connected, and then we can move on to replacing the side panels. The steel side panel was a chore to get back on. The issue was caused by the motherboard and GPU power cables overlapping each other. Now you could say that this issue could be avoided with better cable management, and that is potentially correct. But if that's all it takes to prevent the side panel going back on cleanly, the available space is not exactly great to begin with. Anyway, after laying the case on its side, the panel was able to be pressured back on. And on a different note, the ease of the Windows side panel replacement was welcomed. If you've got this far, I commend you, but can you remember how I mentioned the front fan information I said I'd mention later in the video earlier? Well, this is that moment. This footage was recorded roughly 30 seconds after the first startup of the system, and I cut the power to the system since one of the fans was making quite a bit of noise. Can anyone guess what the problem was? Needless to say, I wasn't exactly happy with the situation, but thanks to the few supporters on Patreon, which you can become one of through the link in the video description, only $1 a month, getting another fan for the channel won't be too much of an expense. So what the hell happened? Why did that fan blade spontaneously break away from the rest of the fan? Well, as far as I can tell, the issue was caused by the direction that the front of the chassis was pressed and cut. Since the panel is pressed outwards, there is a rather large lip sticking out. Note that it's not all sticking out, but just enough is sticking out to create quite an abrupt edge that has come into contact with the fan blade. So what I would suggest is using some washers between the chassis and the frame of the fan to give the fan a very slight offset from the chassis. This is a much bigger pain to install the fans in, but if you really want this case, I wouldn't recommend anything else. Now you could 100% say that it could be the fan's fault, but a counter to that argument is that I've used these 140mm fans on many cases, and they haven't encountered any clipping issues until now. Anyway, with the washers in place and the new tolerance set, we can reconnect the front panel and check out some thermal testing results. Okay, first off, you may have noticed that in the last state you saw the case, there were no filters on the case. I accidentally first tested the case with no filters, but I have retested the case with the filters on, and we can compare those results as well. So with the fan filters on, we're looking at an average of 86.75 degrees Celsius on the CPU and 91 degrees Celsius on the GPU. But if we remove the fan filters, the CPU basically doesn't drop at all, but the GPU improves its temperature by 4 degrees C. So what we can tell from this is that there was just enough accessibility of fresh air to the CPU cooler with or without the filters, maybe from the vents up top. So how does the filtered test result compare to the rest of the cases tested so far? Well, it does pretty well. It gives us one of the cooler GPU temperatures. Note that the GPU fans were spinning at 100%, so it wasn't going to get any cooler, and the CPU cooling was roughly average from what we've tested so far. So what if we throw some exhaust fans up top? Yes, I appreciate the top panel is filtered, but if these were intakes, then we just end up pressurizing the air in the case instead of creating airflow, which is what actually cools the system. And we've tested intakes and exhaust variants up top in a previous video, and exhaust up top is pretty much the way to go. We're also going to replace the rear 1600 RPM fan with a 2200 RPM fan, which should maintain the airflow being drawn through the CPU cooler, as well as increase the exhaust from the GPU below. So with the filters in place with the maximum cooling test, the CPU basically didn't drop in temperature at all, but compared to the filtered standard test, the GPU dropped by 3 degrees Celsius. So it would appear that there has been no increase in airflow through the CPU cooler. You could turn the top fan in front of the CPU cooler into an intake, but like I said, that's been tested before in a previous video and hasn't improved anything before. Compare this to the max test results without filters, and also take into account the 2 degrees Celsius drop in ambient temperature, and it looks like the CPU has dropped by roughly 2 degrees C, and the GPU has dropped by 4 degrees C. So this is a very clear visual on just how much full fan filters affect thermals, and this is on a case that actually has somewhat decent airflow. And of course, comparing the filtered test results with the rest of the cases tested so far, and this case performs pretty much average in the pack. So clearly the trade-off between a clean, closed-off front and a ventilated front has positioned the case right in the middle of the cases that opt for one or the other, which is exactly where you'd expect it to be. So with that out of the way, please enjoy the look of the final build. I'll keep this one short, and I'll catch you in a second for some closing thoughts. So I hope you really enjoyed the video. One thing I didn't cover in the video was how you change the image on the screen. This is the Aegis, not the Aegis Core. The Aegis Core doesn't have the screen, so if you want to save yourself a few pennies, then go for the Aegis Core, not the Aegis. So what you'll do is you'll go to the downloads page from the BitFenix webpage, which is linked in the video description. Go to the download segment from there, download the display app, and then there's an executable which you drag and drop image files onto, and it'll load it onto the memory behind the LCD panel, and then it'll store it there and show it onto the screen. You may want to resize your images and tweak them in Photoshop or Paint or however you want to do that. PNGs work relatively well with this, and you can get a glow effect and that sort of thing, which you may have saw in the video. The LCD panel itself, you may have noticed, has got quite a lot of backlight bleed, and it's not very bright. So in, well, pretty bright lighting as this, you don't really see a lot going on there, so it might not be to your liking. So if you don't like it, go for the Aegis Core. As for the artwork, the new banner, the new logo and that sort of thing, that came from Ryan Bashelier, and he got in contact with me through one of the comments and said that he did this sort of logo creation for YouTubers that he liked their videos of, and he got in contact with me through Facebook as well, and we had a bit of discussion, and he sent me over this sort of stuff. And I think it is fantastic, and I'm definitely going to use it in many videos to come. I think it's very clean and a very nice style. So he wanted me to show this banner, which you'll see now. I think this is something he's working on to create, to store all of his stuff. I hope he does store all of his stuff, and I definitely say he should get some sort of Instagram page where he does all these logos for different YouTubers, and that's basically it. It's fantastic work, and if you appreciate the work in the comments, let him know. He'll probably be watching this video. So that's that. Thank you very much for watching the video. I think this case is fantastic, and I would definitely recommend this case for somebody who was looking to water cool. It will perform very well, and it's a pretty decent air cool performer as well. Unfortunately, due to the damage, the case is going to have to go back, since I'm just going to lose money on selling this in the end. So I have to reduce those losses in order to help the channel along. So if you want to help the channel along as well, then you can always join the Patreon. Like and dislike the video if you liked or disliked it, and let me know in the comments what you thought and if you have any suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.